did these villains go, and what happened to them? How is the Joker get so many series to his name, and so many others have to struggle just to get featured in a single story? Jane Doe is a very creepy villain, and yet I feel like she has barely appeared in the comics since her introduction. I feel like we simply just forgot about her for some reason. Jane Doe was created by Ryan Sook and Dan Slott and made her first appearance back in 2003. She is a villain who likes to adopt the lives of her victims. She'll follow them, study them, and obsess over them until she feels she knows them inside and out. Then she exterminates them and adopts their identity, even going so far as to literally wear their skin. Next up, Ulysses had one very wild and powerful story, being introduced as a kind of Superman of his own from the fourth dimension, but shortly after that he was never seen from again. His story involved him being spirited away to the fourth dimension when he was little by his parents, who were basically attempting to save him from an earthquake which threatened their own lives at that time. Now, while he thought his parents and his original homeworld of Earth had perished, he later learned this wasn't so upon returning to it while chasing down one of his own villains. However, when he learned about the darker side of humanity, he decided the best course of action would be to save Earth from itself, preserving only 6 million of humanity's best and brightest, and letting the rest basically perish. This put him at odds with Superman. His parents, who had survived, actually, were able to appeal to Neil Queen, known as the hero Ulysses, and talk him down, but when the fourth dimension ended up destroyed, Ulysses blamed Superman and the two fought. A really interesting concept for a character, but after this story, he never really appears again. Dr. Poison did appear, at least in some capacity, a few years back. She had a small appearance in the Wonder Woman film that was part of the DC Extended Universe, since rebranded but also restarted and now known as simply the DCU. In the comics, she also appeared somewhat recently, likely thanks to her DCEU appearance, revitalizing an interest in this character. Her Prime Earth continuity version made her first appearance in 2016, a year before the Wonder Woman film came out, and we recently saw her in the Wonder Woman comic in 2022, but we haven't actually seen her since then, and she's an old and amazing character. She was admittedly pretty permanently defeated at the end of the story she last appeared in though, being injected with her own poison and arrested. Talk about a taste of your own medicine. Amazo is another classic and also cool villain, but he very rarely appears in the comics these days. He's an android who can literally replicate the powers of any hero he comes up against. How awesome is that? He first appeared back in the 1960s and rarely appears in the modern age now, having most recently appeared, I believe, back in the Plastic Man Limited series in 2019. Next up, Prometheus was once a really epic Justice League villain, but he's changed a lot over the years, and also isn't as prominent as he once was in the comics. He's been seen in the modern comics, sure, but not for a few years now. In fact, I don't think we've really seen Prometheus as a threat in the comics since about 2018 or thereabouts. His origin story is similar to Batman's, but instead of becoming a hero, he becomes a villain. See, his parents were criminals who died at the hands of those upholding justice, and as a result, he has a vendetta against heroes and all those that fight for the just. Like Batman as well, he traveled the world to become more experienced in many different skill sets and would become extremely dangerous as a result. Prometheus is actually the one who killed Leanne, Roy Harper's daughter, which doesn't bear as much weight since she's now kind of back to being alive again, but at that time it was pretty dramatic and also led to Prometheus being killed in turn as revenge for her death. However, this was also back in the 2010s during the New Earth continuity. This next villain I believe we haven't seen since the Dark Knight's death metal event, which, while not super long ago, was a few years ago now anyways. Parasite was a much more popular villain back in the New Earth continuity. The Rudy Jones Parasite, that is, the original Parasite, not the later versions. However, the fact that there were even other people who took up the mantle after Rudy does show the influence of Parasite was strong enough even to attempt such a thing at one point in time. Rudy Jones was once a regular appearing Superman villain. Initially his story was that he'd been exposed to a biological weapon while working at Star Labs as a janitor, and this resulted in him becoming the villainous energy vampire Parasite. And yet the mighty threat he was once considered is no longer as relevant today as is seen in the revision made to his origin, where he actually got his powers instead from eating a radioactive donut. Yeah, I would say it sounds like a downgrade. They made him goofy. A radioactive donut? Don't eat that. This next villain is really quite classic, but has changed a lot throughout the years. Dr. 13 has evolved into something different in more modern comics, with his original incarnation no longer even discernible in the modern version. Hence why I say he's disappeared, although also even the modern Dr. 13 is no longer around either, but I digress. The original Dr. 13 was the villain of Dollman, a hero who most people also probably don't know about from DC Comics, because Dollman. Dollman was a superhero who could shrink to the size of a small doll, so think like Ant-Man, but I guess kinda cuter, because doll versus ant. Sorry, ants, you are also cute, but maybe not as cute as dolls, unless you're ants in doll form, and then, yeah, pretty cute, honestly. Dollman and Dr. 13 both hailed initially from Quality Comics, which was later acquired by DC. I feel like many Martian Manhunter villains get the short end of the stick when it comes to getting featured in the comics, but this is probably also because they are sharing that short end of the stick with Martian Manhunter himself, who I feel very rarely gets enough time in the spotlight as a hero either. One of Martian Manhunter's villains that I feel like we haven't seen in some time as a result is Dr. Trap. Dr. Trap hasn't shown up in the comics for I believe more than a decade, but you know who hasn't forgotten about him? The Harley Quinn animated series, baby! They don't forget anyone. Here's looking at you, Kite Man. Dr. Trap did make a small appearance in season 2 of that series. In the show, like in the comics, Dr. Trap is a supervillain who specializes in making traps. He was first introduced in the comics in the 90s, and honestly, he does sound like a pretty 90s villain. He also looks like one too. Next up, we have someone that we didn't even know was around until we found out they were, and then they were basically gone after that. Jor-El is a very interesting one. For years, he, like I said, didn't even really exist. Well, not in the living world. You see, Jor-El is Superman's father, and like the rest of Krypton, for a long time we thought he was dead. However, it would later be revealed that he didn't die, but instead had been spying on his son Superman for years, monitoring his progress. Jor-El was revealed to be the true identity of the mysterious ally turned villain, Mr. Oz, and as far as I can tell, we haven't seen him since he died in the comics in 2019 in Superman issue 15. Jor-El had not perished on Krypton, it turned out. As the world ended, he was spirited away and taken to Earth, where he was corrupted and turned into a villain by the horror that is the cruelty of mankind, which he was witness to. From behind the scenes, he would watch his son's progress and occasionally manipulate the world around him. This next villain is one that I love and that I'm actually really sad is gone. Spook is a villain that you likely won't see anymore in the comics because, well, he's dead. But even before his death, he had pretty much been unseen and unheard of for years. Val Caliban first appeared in Detective Comics issue number 434 back in the 1970s. I've always thought he was a pretty cool villain, a man who worked in architecture and used that knowledge to escape the prisons he was later locked up in. Although his costume was definitely a bit goofy. But hey, it made him a good villain to use in the Scooby-Doo and DC Comics crossover comic that happened. Yep, Spook was appropriately featured there. Spook mainly appeared throughout the 70s and 80s here and there, and after returning in the early 2000s, once more breaking out of prison to appear again, he was only a few years later killed off by Damian Wayne, who separated the villain from his head. Poor Spook. I don't believe we've seen him since then, actually, because yeah, he's gone, unless we bring him back. That's about it. I'm your host, Amanda McKnight, aka VanFax13. Until next time, you stay nerdy, YouTube.